speech, indirect speech. North Korea could be preparing to conduct a fourth nuclear test. South Korea's unification minister said on Monday. It doesn't tell you when and where this was said, exactly, apart from Monday, and in which language. He told a meeting with MPs at the National Assembly. They probably spoke Korean. The Yonhap news agency said, so a news agency reporting about an event. His comments came after a South Korean newspaper quoted an unnamed government source as saying, the Allies would respond to direct speech more forcefully than in the recent past, but in a limited way. The New York Times said, citing Pentagon officials. So it's all kind of mediate. You have different sources included in one article which come from different languages, sometimes acknowledged what the source is, sometimes not. The article continues then. The Chinese president, Xi Jinping, not sure, anybody Chinese? alluded to North Korean provocation when he said, no country, direct quote, yeah? He said, should be allowed to throw a region and even the whole world into chaos society. In a speech on Sunday, did he speak English? Probably not. Yeah? In a telephone conversation with UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon at the weekend, China's foreign minister said, in which language did they talk? Did they have a direct telephone conversation? Was it interpreter mediated? One interpreter, two interpreters, where was the interpreter sitting? In a different place? Telephone interpreting, what we can do these days. It's all very, very kind of complex, according to the ministry's website. So in news reporting, it's quite common that different sources are cited. The original source explicitly indicated in detail or not, sometimes just a general reference, and no indication whether this was the original speech in the original language or whether we read a translation. And we don't know if it is a translation, who had provided this translation in the news articles. And again, this kind of positioning according to the website. So here's kind of like a neutral positioning when we said before the state-run communist propaganda website, so it's a political positioning. So in news reports, when we have these kinds of examples, it may be that the journalist used the interpreter's words, that the journalist was present at the press conference in person, or was listening to a press conference via TV or internet, recording it. It may be that they used official translations, so websites of governments very often put their own translations of a speech on the website, so it's kind of an official translation produced by the original government. But also very often we have journalists themselves being translators. So using, if they have foreign language competence, using the foreign text and producing their own versions in English or Hebrew or whatever their language is. Or there may be other options how language or foreign language is dealt with in news reportings. Just want to give you a few examples, for more recent examples here, which can repeat this. A government statement read out by the TV presenter quoted the country's leader Kim Jong-un. I think that's the latest kind of development in North Korea with the rocket testing. Yeah? So quoted the Chinese leader as saying, now we have finally realized the great historic course of completing the state nuclear force, the course of building a rocket power. Again, quoting in English, but he had been speaking in Korean. Kim oversaw the launch of in Pyeongchang, about 80 miles north of the capital. The official KCNA news agency said the missile was more sophisticated than any previously tested and was capable of carrying a super large heavy nuclear warhead. Again, the official KCNA news agency. So that's the official North Korean news agency, and by calling it the official as North Korea, you also kind of position this particular news agency in a particular political perspective. I've put this super large heavy nuclear warhead in red here, because they refer to the news agency KCNA. This news agency also has text in English. There were 2 articles on 29th of November referring to this particular event, which have just been reported about. And in both articles, they speak of super heavy nuclear warhead. Super heavy. So even if they say quoted from KCNA, it was not exactly the same wording as was put on the website of the news agency they had used for their news report. Which again kind of makes you wonder, why do we have sometimes slightly differences in the news report, even if they acknowledge a particular news agency as their source. CNN also had reports about this event, and in the CNN article they speak of the super large heavy warhead. So when we have The Guardian, which we had shown you here, it may well have been that instead of going directly to the KCNA website, they used the CNN news report, which had referred to the KCNA, and took the wording from there. So kind of interaction between different sources without necessarily always openly acknowledging where the source comes from. The country state media made the announcement. That's again this kind of what I said, this political positioning. So you adding a slant, don't take this news agency too seriously because it's a state-owned one. State news agency, KCNA, called its new missile the most powerful ICBM and said it meets the goal of the completion of the rocket weaponry system development after the launch. Kim said, again you have Kim said, but he had been speaking in English, according to KCNA, so you have the official translation on this. In this case here, the red quotes meets the goal, finally realized it's exactly the wording from the KCNA. So in this case, CNN had taken the sentences from the English translations of the North Korean website. But we also have articles in Germany, in the German media, about this particular event. And you have this quote in red, that's the same one in red here. The historic course, so the second quote here. But there is nothing in German on the KCNA website. So it's a German news article referring to this Korean website, the Korean state-owned news agency, quoting in speech, direct in speech marked as a direct quote. But it's somebody must have turned this English text on the website into German. Who was it? The journalist? Probably in this case, yes. Because very often, as I said, it's journalist, but not the journalist who knows Korean, but a journalist who knows English, who used the English version, or a news agency for producing their own German text here. So recently I did a case study with a colleague in Japan, where we looked at the official statement by the Japanese Prime Minister commemorating the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Japan. So whenever there's specific anniversary, so the Japanese Prime Minister would make an official commemorative statement. And so in this state, he spoke in Japanese. There was an official translation into English being done by the Japanese government, or their translation department of the Japanese government. And we noted that there were particularly 2 quotes which had been picked up. We compared then news reporting in English-speaking and German-speaking newspapers about the speech by the Japanese Prime Minister and see how the journalists had dealt with this particular speech. And there were particularly 2 quotes which all newspapers, or 90% of all newspapers, had reported verbatim or as indirect speech. The first one was this one here, where the official translation reads as, Japan has repeatedly expressed the feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for its actions during the war. Deep remorse and heartfelt apology were the kind of key phrases. And we noted that in the German newspapers there was more variation of how these quotes had been dealt with. So this heartfelt apology, tief remorse, so you have tiefe Reue, von Herzen kommende Entschuldigung, Bedauern, empfundene Entschuldigung. So I put it in bold. So Reue, Bedauern, for remorse, apology, the adjectives here. So differences. Some newspapers refer to DPA, which is the German news agency, as their source. But even those which did refer to DPA had sometimes slightly different wordings. So no consistency. The English newspapers had all used the official English translation. Only one, even in the German Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, they had 3 articles referring to this particular speech, and in 2 of them they used slightly different wordings for this particular phrase with the deep remorse and heartfelt apology, with the same journalist given as source, but different wording. So all the English newspapers had used the official translation. The other official quote was, "We must not let our children, grandchildren, and even further generations to come who have nothing to do with that war be predestined to apologize." That's the official translation. Again, the English newspapers used the official translation. The only difference was in the Times, where it read, "who have nothing to do with that war, be destined to carry the burden of apology." So it's not totally different, but it's a slight different word, so not using the official translation. Again, here the German newspapers, much more variation in dealing with this particular second quote here. So this English form here, as my Japanese colleague tells me, was closer to the original Japanese text than the official English translation. We also tried to contact journalists, so for those articles where the name of a journalist had been given, we contacted them. 2 replied, most of the others didn't reply at all, and the journalist for the Times, Richard Lloyd Parry, said the following then, and we asked him why he had not used the official translation, and he replied, "My personal policy is that when statements, answers to questions, or other utterances are made in Japanese, then as far as possible my job is to report on the content of the original, not on someone else's translation. In practice, supplied translations are often very useful and welcome and save a lot of time. I rely on them most days. But with something as important and politically charged as Abe's statement on the war, there was no question. We had to go to the original Japanese, scrutinize it closely for subtle shades of meaning and nuance, and compare it closely to the Japanese used in previous such statements." So he has some Japanese. This also said that he is working with another colleague who is a native speaker of Japanese, so that they tried to go close to the original message here. A bit like our traditional understanding of translation, you have to be as exact to the wording. Yeah? But it's what he says here, it's a politically charged nature of words. And it's a kind of a discourse. So whenever there is particular occasion of commemorating, so also the prime ministers use preset formulations. So this deep remorse and heartfelt apology, or the Japanese words, have been used by Japanese prime ministers over the last 20 years. So there is this, what people expect. So if you change, if you say something differently, then people become actually say, "Oh, he didn't use this word. Is there a new policy? Is there something else going on?" And also the official English translations have stuck to this phrase of deep remorse and heartfelt apology. So which is also then kind of repeated in the discourse. One of the German journalists told us that because she has been living in Japan, she has also some Japanese. She says, "I speak it fluently, it's your own yours," and said that in this case very often she would translate from Japanese herself or refer to English translations prepared by the Japanese government. That's what I said before, so with the CNN and The Guardian, so that text produced by a news agency often serve or function as input, as sources for journalists, so they do not necessarily go back to the original, but use a text in another language. So this German journalist also said, well, there is a professor of Japanese studies, and he also sometimes produces translations of statements, and he had done the translation of this statement by Arber, which we found on the website. So this first quote, the official translation was, Japan has repeatedly expressed the feelings of deep remorse and heartfelt apology for its actions during the war. This professor had translated, is a literal back translation then, as our country, so instead of Japan, our country, has, because of its conduct in the last war, repeatedly expressed the feeling of deep remorse and heartfelt apology. So you see there's a syntactic change, has because of its conduct, so the subclause comes earlier. And this literal back translation, or this German translation here, is closer to the original Japanese one. Yeah? So also the use of our country instead of Japan. So in the official translation, our country had been reproduced or replaced by Japan, which all newspapers had set up. So this also made us wonder then, when German newspapers referred to the news agency DPA as their source, but DPA had used this Japan instead of our country, so also DPA cannot have done it from the original Japanese, but must have used the English news text or the agency report or the official English translation as their source. So translation or news translation, the research into news translation is relatively recent. It started about 10, 15 years ago. Just this book by Bielsa and Wessner, Translation News Agencies. Roberto Valdeon recently published an article in Perspectives about 15 years of researching news translation. And what has been identified so far is news translation is a very complex phenomenon. We have multiple sources, so it's not one source text, one target text as in traditional translation. We have multiple sources. They can be in multiple languages from different sources, different authors, different genres, as I have shown you in some of the examples. So we rarely have a complete source text and a complete target text which we can compare to what we normally do in translation if we want to identify particular strategies. Translation is hidden in the text production process, and very often the language versions are produced by the journalists themselves, multilingual journalists, and so translation is entwined with every aspect of news production. Journalists would not call themselves translators. So say, we are not translating, no, we are producing texts. You know? So translation is this kind of literary production, rewriting for our authors, for our readers. So we do find transformations in news translations, omissions, additions, restructuring, which are determined by the purpose, the institutional practice and policies, and governed above all by the values of journalism. Speed, so news has to be out quickly. There's no time for checking and revision. Readability, also cultural acceptability, desirability, specific cultural sensitivities. It's this translation then. So the example I showed you. Can we speak of translation if there is no one source text, one target text? Or should we use another term? Trans-editing is a term which has often been used by people who look into news translation. This is a term which was initially suggested by Karen Stetting back in 1989, but not for news translation, but she wanted to account for the fuzzy border between translating and editing. And she has actually said that there are 5 cases where trans-editing is practiced. Subtitling, shortening of passages. And news is just point 4, journalists drawing on material in other languages for writing their own text. It's just one of the cases which she gives as an example of this trans-editing. So is there help for research in using trans-editing instead of translation? And if we adopt a label like trans-editing when we talk about news translation, what does it mean for our concept of translation? Are we then not back to say, well, translation is the real thing, so the close equivalent reproduction, everything else needs a different label. So what about all our development in the discipline, which I mentioned some slides before, when we look at social practices and so on. So just to give you another example, when we talk about who are agents or journalists as agents of positioning here, There was an interview which the German Chancellor gave to several European newspapers, LP Spain, the Polish one, the Guardian, La Stampa, Le Monde, and the Süddeutsche Zeitung. As it turned out, the interview was conducted in German only by 3 journalists. The Polish one, the German one, I can't remember what the third one was. And there was a translation into several other languages was produced by the official translation department of the German Foreign Ministry. The Guardian article had as a heading, the German Chancellor speaks candidly to the Guardian and 5 other European newspapers. So it gives the impression that the Guardian was there interviewing Merkel with the others. I contacted the journalist then, and he replied back saying, unlike the Franco-German papers, we do not usually run straight questions and answer interviews, but we take the transcript and decide what the news or story or the interest is. It's again just like the journalist as an agent of positioning politicians, selecting messages, also the way how the text is constructed puts up a kind of relationship between the reader and the audience. So question, then come back to Elder's definition. Positioning involves assignment, shaping and negotiation of reciprocal relations between all parties involved in interaction. So is this, what I've seen in the news reports, is this a form of positioning, or is it not rather something of framing? So when we say reference to this state-owned propaganda news agency, or this politician refused to answer, or these kind of events, I would say, well, it is a kind of framing, but it's also a form of positioning. So it's not direct interaction in the sense like you've analyzed with dialogue, with interviews, with dialogues, but it's a wider dialogue or metaphorical dialogue, because you also have a relationship between the journalist and the readers, and by extension also a relationship is established between the readers, or is expected to be established between the readers and the politicians which are represented in the text. So it may be another form of positioning. You might want to contradict it or not. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Comment or ask a question, you're welcome to do so. Or we are waiting for the coffee break and to talk to me. I think they were waiting for the coffee. Coffee. Oh no, there's one.
You just sent me back 15 years when I worked, 20 years when I worked for a newspaper as a translator in Haaretz. And there would be an interview with some American official, and I had to translate it from the Hebrew, and I realized that I had to have the original English because it would be back translated. And most of the journalists I called, they didn't record it. They just took notes in Hebrew while the Secretary of State or whoever it was speaking, and I had almost no recourse to getting, so I would write it in without quotations because it was very, they had a very cavalier attitude to the need to have the original in English or anything like that. So. And I noticed also that the CNN had a deadline in Washington for the report in Japan.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, true. But it's always then going for the indirect voice is a safer option then. Because then the content is probably still the same, but it's not. Yeah. And we have run several panels on news translation at translation conferences recently. But then at translation conference you talk to your own group of people. So we had tried to have one panel where we wanted to invite journalists or people from media studies. So it was good to have had 3 or 4 researchers from media studies, because their perspective was very useful. But journalists themselves, so it was a bit like, oh no, I'm too busy. I have to do this interview, I have to do this report, why should I go to a conference? But that's something we are still trying to get closer contacts with the journalists themselves, because a lot of it's what we say is kind of speculation. You see something in the text, and also what I said with what are the data, what are we dealing with? So there are certain limitations. You can analyze certain things, and then you see, okay, this is what I see here, but you don't know why was it done. Was it a journalist? Was it a reviser? Was it a space limit? Who had the final word? I talked to an interpreter once and saying, well, it's your words which show up in all these transcripts. Can you look at the transcripts before they are put on the website? No. So there's no time, it needs to be up there immediately. So sometimes I would like to have another chance to see, well, I would have said it differently, but that's the practice.
It goes on live. You interpret
Exactly.
on CNN as press conference live, that's it, it's your voice.
But that makes it interesting for research as well. That's why I think we should talk about it as translation and interpreting, not trying to find different words, because it's interesting for us to find out something more about the practice, what happens in the practice of translation and interpreting. Ella.
Well, I liked very much your talk, and I liked the discussion with the apologies there, and I'm sure that Zohar can contribute there, because, he's done a lot of work on apologies. It's an excellent example of a case where by reframing you reposition the speakers, because by re-editing the apology and adding just a very small nuance, but it's a very determinative nuance, you reframe the source as either a weaker apology or non-apology or whatever. And there are some discussions later over the question, was there an apology or not? So this would be reframing. And the reframing it as an apology or non-apology or weaker or stronger one, you reposition all participants, the original, the source speaker, of course the interpreter, and the recipients and everyone else. So into the introduction of reframing into the notion of repositioning.
Thank you. Thank you. Coffee. Coffee.